more in good health. Better
Thank
health.
you very much. It's great to see you.
Okay, so Boker Tov, Bruchim Habayim, welcome everyone. Great to have you here this morning to do a little bit of study together. What I wanted to do this morning is to take a look at the Parsha, but not so much to explore the narrative, to understand what's going on in the narrative, but more to see how we respond to it. Because often we talk about identifying with the various characters, particularly the patriarchs, the matriarchs, their children, and try to see ourselves in similar situations and similar positions and experiences that they go through during the course of the Genesis narrative. But what I wanted to do today is take a look at how do we respond to what's happening to the certain characters and in specific situations. How do we feel about what they are going through? Not so much in terms of identifying with the event, but what does it make us feel when we see things happening to them at either end of the favorable or unfavorable spectrum? I'll explain a little more what I mean. I was listening to a program on the CBC recently. I don't know if you're familiar with the program Tapestry with Mary Hines. Anyone ever listen to that? Great program. Very, very, very good discussions. And so she discussed two issues, both of which are very relevant to this Parsha, but we're going to focus on the first one. I'll leave the second one to your exploration on your own. So she talked about something called Schadenfreude. And what I want to do is I'm going to play a clip from the show, and then we're going to try to take it from there a little bit. By the way, if I were to ask any of you what Schadenfreude means, how do you understand that? Anybody want to take a guess at it? So it's from a German term, and it's simply, if you take the two words, Schaden is something tragic that happens. Freude is joy. And the juxtaposition of those two to form one word often is meant to say the joy we experience when bad things happen to other people.
Oh dear.
Sounds like a very interesting term. And she interviewed somebody by the name of John Portman, who wrote a book called When Bad Things Happen to Others, if I'm not mistaken, if I got the name of the book right. And we're going to hear a little clip about her interview with him. And then we'll talk a little bit about how that might relate to the Parsha. So just give me a moment. I'm going to share the screen and the sound, and hopefully it'll work. When I start it, just give me a thumbs up to tell me that you can hear it. That's all. So it starts a little abruptly, but hopefully you'll catch what they're saying.
In October, Donald Trump became sick with COVID-19, and Merriam-Webster Dictionary apparently reported that searches for the word Schadenfreude shot up by 30,000%. And I think for a lot of people, the moral dilemma was, is it okay to be happy about this? In your mind, was Schadenfreude okay when Donald Trump got the virus?
Some people felt joy simply because they dislike him as a person. And that is somewhat shameful in my estimation. There are plenty of people we don't like, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily wish ill on them. In this instance, I think that the pleasure was a little more complicated. Donald Trump was, it could be argued, someone who downplayed the seriousness of this malady, someone who at times denied that it was even anything that we should worry about. And when he himself became afflicted with the malady that he downplayed, many people viewed this as a kind of sort of triumph of justice. Donald Trump was, again, it could be argued, denying science and putting many, many people at risk. And when he came down with this very malady, then the score was righted, and people who had doubted the seriousness of the virus came to understand in a vivid way, oh no, this is something I really do need to take seriously. And so in the second case, we could argue that we're not really taking joy in the fact that Donald Trump, a real life human being, could undergo permanent lung damage, or perhaps he could suffer what is being referred to as brain fog even after he recovers from. Our pleasure doesn't come from the fact that Donald Trump is now sick, but the fact that Donald Trump has been corrected in a very public way, and now people see that he was wrong. Now people will take very seriously the COVID-19 virus. So really simple question that you asked me, and maybe the answer strikes you as terribly complex, but there is a lot of nuance here, and that's why myself refrain from making moral judgments about whether people are good or bad simply on the basis of whom they're cheering for or why they're smiling. Our minds are just so complicated. We can never read other people's minds. I oftentimes feel I don't understand myself. I can't understand why some things make me so happy and others make me so sad. So
it's interesting to me how often the word justice comes up in any conversation about Schadenfreude. And I'm wondering where you see justice fitting into this picture. Do I get a pass morally if I'm taking pleasure in someone being punished for doing wrong, for getting their comeuppance?
North America is host to countless millions of Christians, and one of the most influential Christian theologians of all is St. Thomas Aquinas, writing about 800 years ago. And St. Thomas Aquinas is asked, what will the afterlife be like? Will those who make it to heaven, the saints, be able to see the damned in hell? And if so, what will the attitude of the saints be? And St. Thomas responds that yes, God will allow those who make to heaven to observe the unspeakable suffering, torment of those in hell. And St. Thomas teaches us that the blessed in heaven will feel great joy while looking at the unspeakable suffering again of those in hell. Not necessarily because those in hell are suffering unmitigated tribulations, but because their suffering will testify to God's justice. Their suffering will show everyone that, yes, in fact, God did mean it when he gave us commandments and rules, and that these commandments and rules mean nothing without punishment to back up infractions of them. So St. Thomas makes this crucial distinction, which turns on justice. That's to say, God gives us rules. It's up to us whether or not we're going to follow them. And justice has it that those who follow the rules will end up in a good place, and those who break the rules will end up in a bad place. And that it's appropriate for those in the good place to celebrate their good fortune, and also to celebrate the bad fortune of those who don't make it because of justice.
I know I don't have a very sophisticated take on this, but that makes me kind of despise God. That's a really small-minded, small-hearted version of a deity to me. I mean, how does it strike you, a God who delights in seeing the eternal torment of those who have fallen astray or fallen afoul of the rules?
Okay, we'll leave it at that for starters. So those of you who joined us just in the last couple of minutes, just to bring you up to, we're talking about Schadenfreude, something which is often interpreted as the joy we experience when seeing others go through tribulation, suffering, watching bad things happen to others and simply enjoying it. And the author that is being interviewed on the show Tapestry, John Portman, brings in all sorts of other examples about how this happens. When we look at comedy, what happens in comedy? We see comic slapstick, comic routines. We see somebody slip on a banana peel. We laugh. It's very funny. This person, and then he differentiates, and this will bring us back to our Parashah. He differentiates between that when something happens to somebody and then it passes, as opposed to something happens to somebody, falls on a banana peel, and breaks their neck. suffers brain damage and is in a wheelchair for the rest of their life, all of a sudden it's not so funny. It's gone beyond a certain line where the joy we initially experienced from their misfortune is not so much joy anymore. And we can get to a point where we're a little more sympathetic, if not empathetic, to what they're going through. But that's an extreme case. And the whole discussion came up, if you joined us a little bit late, because the Google reported a 30,000% increase in interest in the word Schadenfreude when it was revealed that Donald Trump had contracted coronavirus. And meaning that people were overjoyed by the fact that this person who'd belittled the effect of what coronavirus was doing, and he finally has perhaps a better understanding, although as we learned afterwards, perhaps not such a better understanding. In any case, it got me thinking when I heard this program, how appropriate it might be to our Parashah and to consider some of the characters in the Parashah who go through various experiences and connected with this idea of justice, perhaps suffering because they have done something to others. And so we are joyed by the fact that they are getting their just deserts, or they're getting back in spades what they dealt out to others. And let's just take a few experiences of some of the characters in this week's Parsha and some of the Parshiot around. So for example, when we look at Jacob, we see Jacob in last week's, a couple Parshiot ago, where he cheats his brother out of the birthright. Now let me ask you outright, and there are a few of us, so hopefully you'll respond. When Jacob gets cheated by Lavan, where Leah is substituted for Rachel, this deceit that Jacob gets in turn, whether or not it's exactly because of what he did to his brother, but do you feel a sense of joy when Jacob gets cheated with regards to the wives, given Leah instead of Rachel initially at least, because of what he did to his brother and to his father, deceiving his brother, his father, of course, dressing up as Esau to get the blessing. Is that what you felt when that happens to Jacob? Or do you say to yourself, this is a terrible thing. How could Lavan do something like that? Anyone want to respond? What was your feeling the first time, if you can recall, or even maybe the umpteenth time when you read it recently, when Jacob gets cheated with regards to the wife he has chosen first and gets Leah instead? Or maybe you haven't thought about it. So feel free to take yourselves off mute and share. Go ahead, Ruth.
I would say my gut reaction, my initial reaction was, oh my God, that's terrible. This is a horrible thing. But now as I think about it more, he wasn't so nice, and, karma, he's getting what he deserves. But initially I thought that's horrible.
Okay, I think that when it depends certainly on the situation, because perhaps somebody cheated on their wedding night. I imagine for most of us that is such a horrible thing to think of, that regardless of what that person had done earlier, that's not something that we can feel joy at, because maybe it touches a little too close to home. Although, if you think about COVID, somebody getting COVID, I think most of us at least know of someone who's contracted COVID or been affected by that in terms of their ability to be together with family. The whole issue of separation and isolation is something that touches us all. Yet despite that, so many millions of people apparently experienced this joy when Donald Trump contracted the disease. So perhaps it depends a little bit on this specific situation. Let's consider some other characters in this Genesis narrative. Lavan is a less attractive figure to begin with. But when he is perhaps cheated by Jacob, not so dishonestly, of course, but when Jacob is able to take all the flocks with him because of this sophisticated magical means with the special stick, the special staff that gets them all bespeckled, whatever, very complicated story. And then even more so when Rachel takes her father's, Lavan's idols and hides them in the seat of the camel. Do you feel joy when Lavan gets perhaps his just desserts for deceiving Jacob with regards to the daughters? Or is it kind of neutral? I mean, do you feel good about Lavan being cheated? Yeah, Ruth's saying yes. Yeah. Anyone else?
I honestly don't know, because it's a real dilemma. It doesn't say a lot for humanity if we take joy in others.
Yeah.
Okay.
One deceit follows another and just builds on it.
Yeah, Barbara makes a good point, though. Have to agree with her.
Okay, so do you see that? Well, let me ask you, have you personally, and you don't have to go into specifics, but have any of you ever experienced Schadenfreude, this joy at seeing somebody else, whatever the nature of that joy was, but at seeing somebody else, whoever that person may have been, whatever they may have done, as you think to deserve it, have you ever taken joy in somebody going through something unfortunate? Again, you don't have to share. You don't have to share if you don't want, but if you want to, that'd be more interesting. But have you ever experienced that, Schadenfreude? Barb,
I'm not sure that it's joy. Sometimes I feel a little bit of relief that somebody might be finally getting a taste of their own medicine and realize what was done. So I wasn't happy that Trump got COVID, but I was relieved in that perhaps this might come as a wake-up call and a reality check to him. But of course, I don't know who we're dealing with, so that didn't happen. But in some other cases, sometimes it is a good thing, but I don't feel joy at the expense of others. That's not in my nature.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with Barbara. I don't actually feel joy, but I say, gosh, they got what they deserved.
Okay, well, I imagine. I mean, and this John Portman that she interviews, she talks a lot about how do we define this joy or happiness? What kind of happiness is there? There's different types of happiness. Happiness at achieving something you've always wanted, at seeing somebody else achieve something you wanted. But he says there's also this type of happiness in seeing justice served. That is a type of this Freude, which can be broadly interpreted in these types of circumstances. And we heard that section about justice, somebody receiving perhaps a better insight through their suffering and misfortune because they didn't have that insight, that understanding about how to behave before. And I bring, of course, the situation of Joseph. It's very clear from many commentators who say this experience that the immature Joseph goes through about sharing arrogantly his dreams of domination and ascendance and supremacy over his family, over his brothers, by sharing those dreams with them, is something that he receives his comeuppance for by being sold as a lowly slave, by serving in the house of Potiphar. And it's only through that misfortune that he's able to see and understand how he might not have acted appropriately in the past. And this is what John Portman talks about as well. It's not so much when he discusses the theology of Thomas Aquinas about those who make it to heaven enjoying the suffering of those who are in hell or purgatory or wherever they may have ended up, not because they're suffering, but because that suffering will bring about a realization perhaps on their part and an acknowledgement of what they've done wrong. And perhaps even more so, it'll make others aware of what the consequences of their actions are. So if somebody sees that as justice being served, even at the expense and the misfortune of others, it's something that will bring benefit to both individuals, to community, and perhaps the world at large by more people being aware of the consequences of inappropriate actions. So that joy may not be so much in somebody suffering, but the implications and the acknowledgement and understanding that comes about as a result of people suffering for what they've done. So there are many different ways of interpreting that. And when I'm trying to recall how I first felt about Joseph and his brothers during that first meeting. What does Joseph do? He puts his brothers through the ringer when he sees them. It doesn't talk about initially how he feels about that. It doesn't say that he's enjoying their suffering. Eventually, he breaks down because he wants to reconcile and reestablish his relationship with his brothers in a very different way than it had existed before, partly through his acknowledgement of what he had done wrong, but partly through understanding, I would imagine, again, even though it's not described in any close to psychological terms in the Torah, he understands perhaps what he went through in realizing his misdeeds in the past, and perhaps he's putting his brothers through something similar so they can go through the same maturing process and understand that they treated their brother ill as well. Not just whether his arrogance and his braggadocio were inappropriate is not the point. They responded much more severely and harshly than they should have, and perhaps their suffering, their misfortune through what Joseph does to them is something that brings about that acknowledgement. So I think there's a difference between, and we can decide for ourselves, between actually enjoying somebody suffering or something bad happening to somebody, like slipping on a banana peel. I mean, that's whatever you look at it, why is it funny?
No idea, but we laugh.
But we laugh. We laugh when that happens. When a can of paint falls on somebody's head from above. We laugh at those things to a certain extent, unless they're permanently harmful or do something that's going to cause what we might define as excessive misfortune to somebody. But we laugh at those things, and we have to understand why we laugh. We're not sure we understand why we laugh. Why would we enjoy somebody slipping on
somebody's misfortune?
Funny. Why is that funny? So certain philosophers say that we have this innate element in us, not just based on justice, but and they're not always able to explain it. That there's something that gives us joy for whatever reason. But somebody experiencing some kind of misfortune. I'd like to put that kind of thing aside. I'm not sure if I agree with that innately. And I think, like Barb said before, I'm not sure I feel good. I would feel good if I laughed and felt joy at somebody else's misfortune. I'll admit, I'll admit wholeheartedly, and I'm being recorded on this, that when Donald Trump contracted coronavirus, not that I was hoping that he would die, or as John Portman says, suffer brain fog, brain damage, permanent damage to his lungs. I wasn't thinking of that. I was just thinking, this makes sense. And this is something I can take joy in at this stage because it hasn't gone too far, but it's the right thing. It should happen. It should have happened. This is what needs to happen to try to silence some of the mishigas that's been coming out of his mouth for so many years. But again, had he suffered something more permanent, and I won't say God forbid, but fatal, then I imagine most people would feel much different. I don't think the majority of that 30,000% interested in understanding Schadenfreude would have been happy the fact that something tragic had happened to Donald Trump. But there is something about our desire to see justice done, even if it's at the expense of somebody who's done something, not even, but because it's at the expense of somebody who has done some kind of injustice to others. And to take another example, this is maybe seem a little bit strange to you, but look at what happens to Rachel, to Rachel. She complains that she's not able to give birth, and it sounds rather tragic. She's Jacob's love, but she has to wait an additional 7 years to be able to be his wife. She gives birth to a second son, but dies giving birth. She steals the idols from Lavan and doesn't get caught, but causes perhaps a lot of anger between Lavan and Jacob, because Jacob says, if you find anything here, then take it. Of course, nobody took anything of yours. And in fact, she had done that. So when something bad, when Rachel dies in childbirth, that's well beyond our level of acceptability in terms of being punished or something, a bad misfortune, having joy. Had something happened to her other than that as a result of her acts, as minor as they may seem, we might have felt a little bit differently. But when it results in death, and certainly in childbirth, which can be a very painful experience for us to see others going through, that's something that's well beyond where it's something we would enjoy and see any type of joy out of. But all these other characters, at one point or another, even if we were not aware of it, if we think of it, and again, it's hard to recollect the first time we read these stories, but you can take many other stories in the Bible as well. Try to think of some of those instances where you enjoyed seeing something bad happen to somebody. Are there any other examples you can think of in the Bible where some misfortune falls upon a character and you enjoyed seeing that happen? What about Goliath? Did you enjoy when Goliath gets smattered in the head with a stone from David's slingshot? Does that make you feel good? Did you feel joy at that? So there's a phrase before you answer that, and it happens to, come from Mishle, from Proverbs. Bin fol oivecha al tismach. Don't be joyous at the fall of your enemies. Don't celebrate the misfortune of your enemies, whether it's in war or otherwise. So why would the Torah say something like that? Why would the Torah warn us through Proverbs not to take joy in the suffering and the misfortune of others, even if they're your enemy? I would dare say that, as with many instances, when the Torah talks about human nature, the Torah is onto something here. There's a realization that humanity does take joy in the misfortune of others, particularly enemies, but not only our enemies. And the Torah is warning us against that. That's not something we should do. It warns us much later than the occurrence of the narratives in Genesis. It's not until we get to a later section of the Tanakh, of the Bible, in Proverbs, that we read about this warning. But perhaps we need to be more aware of that as we go through the narrative cycles in Genesis and other parts of the Bible, especially in the Torah, where it's very easy to fall into that emotional comfort, if I can say that, of enjoying a bad thing that happens to somebody else. Anyone have any comments or?
Hi, Michael. It's Rosalie.
Hi,
I
Rosalie.
don't enjoy bad things happening to people, but I'd like to see justice. So, if somebody's arrested, you want to see proper justice done. And that to me would be punishment enough.
Okay.
I'm thinking about when all the Egyptians went into the Red Sea and the Red
I
Sea.
thought exactly the same thing, Barbara. These are men who left behind wives and children, and they were, they had no choice, but they had to be in the army just as anyone has, decides that they want to be or have to be to defend their country. And these are innocent people that die. Well, I don't know how innocent, but I mean, they leave behind families and loved ones.
So yeah, true. So
and what was the conflict?
That's a great example. And I didn't want to bring that one up because I was hoping somebody would mention that, because that's a very powerful one. And I don't know if you might have felt that when reading that section for the first time, but if you can, do you recall, and I imagine most of you have you seen the film, The 10 Commandments, with, of course, with Yul Brynner and Charlton Heston? I imagine most of you have seen that. Can you try to recall when you saw that scene, as unsophisticated technologically and technically as it was compared to the modern films, when you saw the sea collapsing on those soldiers, what did you feel? Was it celebration because
no,
here the children of Israel have been saved from something potentially disastrous? Or did you feel bad as you see those chariots and Egyptians underwater, blowing bubbles underwater? I remember very powerfully that scene there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did anybody recall what they felt when they saw that the first time during the Ten Commandments?
It was a shock for me.
I loved it. I was so happy.
And I'm not sure we need to be dishonest with ourselves and the fact that there's joy in that. And especially if you see that around Pesach, when you're about to read all that stuff at the Seder, and this idea of redemption and being saved from slavery and from perhaps death in the desert at the hands of the Egyptians and the chariots, there's a great relief, if not joy, at seeing that threat eliminated all of a sudden. But I think sorry, go ahead, Lynn.
I was just going to say, it's interesting. I was just thinking about it. The plagues, all of them until the last one, I felt were justified, but the death of the firstborn really bothers me.
So I think that's a great point, because when we think of those plagues, that goes back to what John Portman says. We accept and enjoy misfortune to a limit. When we think about blood, all right, so the water tasted lousy, they couldn't drink, they've got lice in their head, all the cattle are dying, so they can't have a barbecue. All these types of plagues, it seems horrible, but it doesn't cross a certain line. But the moment something very tragic or death is incurred, that seems to cross that line where it's no longer enjoyable. All of a sudden, it strikes us as something we should not be taking joy in. And I think you're right. I think that line comes at the point where the firstborn, and I remember that very powerful scene with Yul Brynner standing beside his son that he places on an altar and be lamenting his son's death, is incredibly powerful. You can't feel joy at the suffering that a father experiences watching his son die and then being there beside his dead son. So that's something that perhaps crosses the line of where Schadenfreude can apply. But perhaps Schadenfreude does apply with all those plagues. I agree with you. I think it's a great distinction, Lynn. I'll just read you one last thing. This is what John Portman, this is his final statement at the end. And I would invite you to listen to the whole conversation. It's quite interesting. So this is what he says at the end when he's talking about how he felt with regards to Donald Trump contracting COVID-19. He said, "It did make me feel base, and it did make me think that a more evolved person would not have felt that. I definitely did feel both of those at the same time." So the awareness that part of our human nature, for whatever reason, and perhaps it's difficult to understand, engages in a sense of enjoyment or joy when bad things happen to other people, but to acknowledge the fact that we experience and feel that emotion, but at the same time, to feel that I really shouldn't be feeling this. I'm aware of this feeling, but at the same time as I'm feeling joy, I'm feeling lousy because I shouldn't be feeling this joy. And I think that is perhaps the best place we can be. Be honest with what we experience, part of human nature, whether we're able to overcome that or not, as we do and try with other elements of our nature. But to be aware that it's problematic, it's complicated. It's not something that we can't truly enjoy the joy of Schadenfreude. It's really a mixed bag of experience. And again, I would challenge you to explore some of the other experiences in the Genesis narrative and in the Bible in general, when these kinds of things happened to our enemies or those within the Israelites, whoever it be, whether it be Shaul, and all sorts of characters and specific narratives that occur. Try to explore that and see if you can genuinely and honestly understand how you feel about what happens to those individuals. And I would dare challenge you to explore those experiences in your life where others have experienced misfortune, and try to be honest with yourselves. Say, oh, I would never know. Of course I don't feel that. Of course I don't enjoy that. Don't be so quick to deny what you may have felt at the time and not wanted to acknowledge this because you think there's something wrong with it. And when we talk about Schadenfreude, at least John Portman discusses it as something, he sees it as something neutral. A lot of people see it as something bad, something base, but he initially says it's a neutral experience. You know, there's a joy at this, and that's it. I'm not going to evaluate or criticize Schadenfreude or praise Schadenfreude. That's something people experience. And as with most of our emotional experiences, it's not necessarily something you can categorize as good or evil. That's the way we are. That's what we experience. And we have to know how to cope with it and how to deal with it. So I encourage you to go onto the CBC, watch the entire interview. It's quite interesting. And the other one that we're not going to get to today, but certainly relevant for this week's Parsha, she talks about Schadenfreude, and I don't know if it's a coincidence it happened to be this past week, but besides Schadenfreude, they talk about the value of gossip. And of course, gossip is a very powerful element in this week's Parsha as well with regards to Joseph and his brothers. So hopefully you have a chance. The whole show is only 50-something minutes, 52, 53 minutes for both of those elements. And I hope you enjoy that. So hopefully you've had a little bit of an ear opening to certain ways of perceiving, as I did when I listened to that show the other day. And it gives you a different perspective on how to evaluate not just the characters in the Tanakh, but ourselves, how we relate to that. Not necessarily how we identify specifically with their experience, but what our emotional responses to what they're experiencing. And that is as valued as anything else we go through when we read the Tanakh. So I apologize. I'll take a couple of comments, and then I unfortunately I have to get to a doctor's appointment with my father. Sorry. Go ahead, Barb.
Go ahead, no problem. It's an interesting explanation of human nature. And we have joy, we have relief, we have comic relief, and how do we understand our reactions to it? And it's really fascinating to look at human nature.
Indeed.
Okay, well, I wish everybody a wonderful day.
I just
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. This is one of the highlights of my week. Thank you so much.
A pleasure studying with all of you, as always.
It was excellent.
Nice to see.
Okay.
Thank you.
So interesting. Everybody stay safe and have a good day.
And Mazal Tov, happy birthday to Sue Ann again.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
You too.
Yes.
Take care.